was a cold, rain-soaked evening when Grace arrived at the bustling city bus terminal, her younger sister, Vivian, trailing behind her. The city skyline loomed in the distance, vast and imposing, its lights flickering in the gloom of the storm. Grace had spent years building a life here, a life free from the suffocating poverty of their rural village. Now, with a heart full of hope, she was determined to give Vivian a fresh start. Vivian was naive and wide-eyed, overwhelmed by the tall skyscrapers, the crowded streets, and the noise that seemed to never cease. Grace and her husband, Daniel, welcomed Vivian into their modest apartment. It was small but warm, filled with the smell of home-cooked meals and the quiet, reassuring hum of normalcy. At first, their days together were filled with peace. Vivian helped Grace with the housework, charmed everyone she met, and even won Daniel's affection with her sweetness. It was the beginning of what Grace thought would be a beautiful new chapter for them all. But this peace would not last. It didn't take long before Vivian's admiration for Daniel turned into something darker, something twisted. She began to watch him closely, learning his routines, noticing the small things about him that no one else did, the way he smiled, how his eyes would light up when he spoke about the things he loved. To Vivian, he was perfect, and it wasn't long before her innocent admiration transformed into a suffocating obsession. She would follow him around the house, her gaze never straying too far from him. Her envy for Grace grew stronger each day, her thoughts darker. A part of her began to resent her sister for keeping Daniel to herself. She had to have him, whatever the cost. And so, the seed of betrayal was planted. One evening, Vivian overheard two strangers talking about a woman, a spirit medium, who could grant wishes beyond the mortal realm. The whispers filled her with a dangerous kind of hope. She had heard rumors about the woman, who was said to be able to break the natural laws of life and death for the right price. Vivian was desperate. She needed Daniel to love her, to choose her above Grace. Without hesitation, Vivian set out to find the medium, walking through the shadowy streets that led her to a crumbling, decrepit building tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of incense, and the shadows clung to the walls like ghosts. The medium was an old woman with sunken eyes and a voice that seemed to echo from deep within the earth. "I want my sister gone," Vivian said, her voice barely a whisper as she looked into the woman's unblinking gaze. The medium stared at her, unflinching. "The price will be steep," she warned, her voice low and gravelly. "Are you prepared to pay?" Vivian nodded, her eyes wide with an unsettling determination. The medium didn't need any more explanation. She lit black candles and chanted in a guttural, ancient tongue. She then handed Vivian a small vial filled with dark, viscous liquid. 3 drops. Into her drink. By the 3rd day, she will be gone. Vivian left the medium's lair, clutching the vial with trembling hands. She felt no fear, only an intense, burning desire to make her sister's death a reality. Grace, unsuspecting, drank from the cup Vivian prepared for her. Within days, Grace fell ill, though there were no signs of poisoning. Her body grew pale, her breath shallow, until one morning, she simply didn't wake up. The doctors could find no cause of death. The world, including Daniel, was left reeling. Grace's funeral was a sorrowful affair, and Vivian played the role of grieving sister, tears flowing easily, though her heart burned with twisted satisfaction. The woman she had envied was gone, forever. But this was only the beginning. A year after Grace's death, Vivian returned to the medium. She needed more. She needed Daniel to look at her the way he once looked at Grace. The medium agreed to help, though her warnings grew more ominous. "This bond will twist his soul. It will change both of you forever. Do you understand?" Vivian nodded, her eyes vacant, consumed by her obsession. The medium performed the ritual once more, an unholy incantation that ripped through the very fabric of the world. Vivian could feel the power of the spell coursing through her, feeding her desires, making her stronger. Days later, Daniel began to act strange. He started looking at Vivian in ways he never had before, his gaze lingering, his smile warmer. Despite the awkwardness, despite the whispers of their friends and family, Daniel proposed to Vivian. The wedding was small, held in an old chapel at the edge of town, with flickering candlelight casting twisted shadows on the walls. The wedding night marked the beginning of something far darker than Vivian could have imagined. That very night, they moved into their new home, an old house far from the city, nestled in a forest of dead trees. The house was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it. Something alive. The strange occurrences began within days. At first, it was knocks on the door and objects disappearing and reappearing, cold drafts sweeping through rooms with no open windows. But soon, things escalated. The footsteps started. They began at the far end of the house, slow and deliberate, always at night. The sound of shoes dragging across the floor echoed through the dark halls, growing louder as they approached the bedroom door. Vivian would lie awake, listening, her heart hammering in her chest. One night, the footsteps were so loud, they sounded as though someone were standing right outside their door. "Do you hear that?" Vivian whispered to Daniel, clutching him in terror. "It's nothing," Daniel replied weakly, though his face was pale with fear. But Vivian knew it wasn't nothing. Soon after, strange voices began to haunt them, whispers in the dark, barely audible at first, but then clearer, louder. The cries of a woman, soft at first, then louder, filled with agony. Vivian would wake in the middle of the night, her ears ringing with the sorrowful wails. She also began to wake with fresh, bloody scratches across her arms and legs. Thin, burning lines that would appear overnight, as though claws had raked her skin in the dark. No matter how tightly she locked the door, how many times she checked the room, the scratches returned each morning. One night, as the scratching became unbearable, Vivian looked in the mirror. Her eyes went wide with horror as blood began to drip from her eyes and mouth, staining her skin in thick, dark streams. "What is happening to me?" she whispered, feeling her body betray her. Daniel, too, began to suffer. His dreams became nightmares, nightmares that felt too real, too suffocating. In one of them, he stood in their bedroom, staring at the figure of Grace. She stood at the foot of their bed, tears streaming down her pale face. With trembling hands, she pointed directly at Vivian. Daniel awoke, gasping for air, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was freezing cold, and for a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move in the corner. He couldn't sleep again that night. The night that would change everything came when the clock struck 1 a.m. Vivian woke with a start, the air thick with a suffocating pressure. She heard it again, the footsteps, dragging closer and closer. But this time, there was something different. The door to their bedroom creaked open on its own. Then, a voice. Soft. Whispers at first. But then, clear as day. Confess. Vivian screamed as a cold, bone-chilling presence filled the room. It was Grace, her ghost, her eyes wide with fury, standing at the foot of the bed. The spirit's once gentle face was now twisted in a mask of rage and sorrow. "You took everything from me," Grace hissed. Now you will suffer as I did." Vivian collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. In the presence of Grace's spirit, she confessed everything: the obsession, the poisoning, the dark magic that had sealed Grace's fate. As the confession left her lips, Vivian's body began to convulse violently. Her eyes rolled back into her skull, her mouth gaping open in a silent scream. Blood poured from her eyes, nose, and mouth in thick, viscous streams, staining the floor beneath her. The air grew thick with the stench of death, and the house seemed to shake. With a final, blood-curdling scream, Vivian collapsed, lifeless. Her body lay frozen in a horrifying, unnatural position, blood pooling around her. Daniel, now free from the medium's spell, watched in horror as Vivian's body lay before him. He felt an overwhelming wave of clarity wash over him. Memories of Grace flooded his mind, and he wept bitterly for the monster he had become. He realized too late the monstrous betrayal he had allowed to happen. Daniel, broken by the horrors he had witnessed, fled the house that night, leaving behind the woman he had once loved and the home that had become a prison of darkness. The house, now abandoned, became a place of legend. Locals spoke of seeing Grace's figure in the windows, her mournful, tear-filled eyes staring out into the night. The sound of footsteps could still be heard in the dead of night, and some even claimed to hear Vivian's screams echoing through the empty halls. No one dared to enter. The darkness within the house was said to consume all who ventured too close, just as it had consumed Grace and Vivian.